The screaming began at 3 in the morning, piercing through the November fog that clung to Millbrook like a burial shroud. Martha Blackwood bolted upright in her bed, her nightgown damp with cold sweat, knowing with a terrible certainty that only a mother possesses that the sound had torn from her daughter's throat. By the time she reached young Constance's room, the child stood rigid at the window, her small hands pressed flat against the frost-covered glass, her eyes reflecting the pale moonlight like twin mirrors of madness. "The wheel," Constance whispered, her breath fogging the window-pane. "It's calling to me, Mother. Can you hear it singing?" Martha heard nothing but the distant rush of Mill Creek and the groaning of timber in the wind, yet as she followed her daughter's gaze toward the old Pemberton mill, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settled deep in her bones. The great water-wheel, silhouetted against the night sky, appeared to turn with impossible smoothness despite having been broken for nigh on 20 years. This was the third night in a fortnight that Constance had awakened thus, drawn to that accursed window as iron filings to a lodestone. Each morning brought the child paler, more distant, her bright chatter replaced by strange mutterings about music only she could hear. Dr. Whitmore attributed it to nerves and prescribed laudanum, but Martha knew better. Evil had awakened in Millbrook, and it hungered for the young. The mill had stood abandoned since the autumn of 1847, when old Jeremiah Pemberton and his 3 sons had vanished without trace on the night of the harvest moon. The constables found no bodies, no blood, only their clothes folded neat as Sunday service beside the wheel pit, and the great wooden paddles frozen solid despite the rushing water. Some whispered of debts to dangerous men from Boston. Others spoke of a family curse that had followed the Pembertons from the old country. But the children of the village knew the truth that adults refused to speak. The mill wheel had claimed them, as it had claimed others before, grinding their souls to powder as surely as it had once ground wheat to flour. Now, as Martha drew her daughter back from the window, she noticed the child's lips moving in silent rhythm, her head swaying ever so slightly from side to side. The motion was hypnotic, unsettling, like the pendulum of a clock counting down to some unthinkable hour. "Come away, my darling," Martha whispered, but Constance remained transfixed, her gaze locked upon that distant wheel. "It knows my name," the child breathed. "It's been waiting so very long." The next morning brought no relief, only deeper dread. Constance picked at her breakfast, her porridge growing cold as she stared toward the mill through the kitchen window. When Martha finally coaxed her away, the child moved with the jerky, reluctant steps of a marionette whose strings were being tugged by unseen hands. "Mrs. Blackwood." The urgent voice belonged to Temperance Good, the minister's wife, her usually composed features twisted with worry. "Have you seen my William this morning? His bed's not been slept in, and the back door stands wide open." Martha's blood turned to ice water. Young William Good, barely 8 years old, was Constance's dearest companion. The 2 children were inseparable, thick as thieves, sharing secrets and games that only childhood could conceive. "Constance," Martha called, but her daughter had vanished from the kitchen like morning mist. They found both children at the mill wheel, standing motionless in the tall grass that had grown wild around the stone foundation. William stood nearest the wheel, his small form perfectly still, his face bearing an expression of rapturous concentration. Constance stood 3 paces behind him, and behind her, like a line of silent sentinels, were 4 more children from the village, the Hartwell twins, little Sarah Morse, and young Timothy Fletcher. All 6 children swayed gently from side to side, their movements synchronized as if controlled by a single mind. Their eyes remained fixed upon the massive wheel, which turned with that same impossible smoothness Martha had observed the night before, its ancient timbers groaning a rhythm that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "Children!" Temperance Good cried out, but none turned at her voice. "William, come away from there this instant." Martha approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she drew nearer, she began to hear it, a low, melodious humming that seemed to emanate from the wheel itself. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like a lullaby sung by angels who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. "Constance," she whispered, reaching out to touch her daughter's shoulder. The child's skin was cold as winter stone, and when Martha's fingers made contact, Constance began to turn. Not toward her mother, but in place, a slow, measured rotation that matched the rhythm of the wheel. Her eyes never left the spinning paddles, and her lips curved in a smile of such profound contentment that Martha stumbled backward in horror. One by one, the other children began to turn as well, their small bodies revolving like the spokes of some hellish carousel. The humming grew louder, more complex, weaving harmonies that made Martha's teeth ache and her vision blur. She tried to call out, to break the spell that held the children captive, but her voice seemed to shatter against the music like glass against stone. Reverend Good arrived breathless, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a great crow. He took one look at the scene before him and began to pray, his voice rising in desperate supplication. But the ancient words of comfort and protection seemed to wither in the air, devoured by the mill wheel's terrible song. "We must fetch help," he gasped, seizing Martha's arm. "The constable, Dr. Whitmore." "No," Martha whispered, transfixed by the sight of her daughter's slow, inexorable rotation. "Look at their faces. They're not suffering. They're content." And it was true. Each child wore an expression of perfect peace, as if they had finally found the thing their souls had been searching for. Their turning grew more pronounced, more assured, and Martha realized with dawning horror that they were learning the wheel's rhythm, becoming part of its ancient mechanism. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his medical bag clutched in one trembling hand. He was a practical man, trained in Edinburgh, who believed in the power of science to illuminate even the darkest mysteries. But as he approached the children, his confident stride faltered, and his face went gray as old parchment. "Catatonia," he muttered, more to convince himself than others. Some form of group hysteria, perhaps induced by shared delusion or— His words trailed away as young Timothy Fletcher completed a full rotation, his small face now pointing back toward the wheel with mechanical precision. "Doctor," Martha pleaded, "surely there must be something." "Stand back," Dr. Whitmore commanded, pulling a vial of smelling salts from his bag. He uncorked it and thrust it beneath William Good's nose, but the boy showed no response. The pungent ammonia might as well have been flower petals for all the effect it produced. The physician tried each child in turn, even resorting to gentle slaps across their cheeks, but none reacted. They continued their slow rotation, their movements growing more fluid, more natural, as if they had been turning thus for years rather than hours. "This is beyond my understanding," Dr. Whitmore confessed, his usual pompous demeanor cracking like old leather. "I've read of such cases in the medical journals, instances of mass hysteria, sympathetic nervous disorders, but never have I witnessed." His voice broke as Sarah Morse, the youngest at barely 6 years old, began to hum along with the wheel's song. Her voice was high and sweet, weaving through the deeper harmonies like silver thread through dark cloth. Soon the other children joined her, their voices blending into a chorus that made the very air shimmer with malevolent beauty. Constable Bradford arrived as the sun reached its zenith, his brass buttons winking in the pale autumn light. He was a sturdy man, built like an oak tree, who had served with distinction in the war against Mexico. But even his soldier's composure cracked as he beheld the circle of turning children. "Sweet Mother of Christ," he breathed, crossing himself with a hand that shook like a leaf in winter wind. "What devil's work is this?" Reverend Good had spent the morning in desperate prayer, his knees grinding against the cold earth as he beseeched the Almighty for deliverance. Now he rose on unsteady legs, his face haggard with exhaustion and dawning despair. "I fear," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "that we face something far older than our faith, older than our understanding. This mill has stood for nigh on 50 years, but the wheel is older still. I've been researching in the church records, tracing back through the deeds and surveys, and I found references to a wheel of sorrows that stood upon this ground long before Jeremiah Pemberton ever set foot in Massachusetts." He pulled a leather-bound ledger from beneath his coat, its pages yellow with age and brittle as autumn leaves. Here, in the testament of Jonas Whitmarsh, who surveyed this land in 1798, upon the creek there stands a wheel of strange design, wrought not by Christian hands but by those who worshipped older gods. The local Indians speak of it in whispered tones, calling it the Hungry Wheel, and warn that children who venture near are lost to its endless turning. The constable spat into the grass, his military bearing reasserting itself in the face of superstition. Nonsense and poppycock! These are Christian children, born of Christian families, not some heathen sacrifices to pagan gods. There must be a rational explanation: contaminated well water, perhaps, or some form of ergot poisoning from spoiled grain. But even as he spoke, the children's humming grew louder, more insistent, and their turning quickened. What had been a slow, dreamy rotation now took on urgency, purpose. They spun like dancers at a festival, their small arms beginning to extend from their sides as if to catch the wind. Martha could bear no more. With a cry that came from the deepest part of her mother's heart, she rushed forward and seized Constance by the shoulders. The child's body was rigid as iron, locked in its terrible dance, but Martha held tight, trying through sheer force of will to break the spell that bound her daughter. For a moment their eyes met, mother and child locked in a battle for the girl's very soul. Constance's gaze was distant, dreamy, filled with visions of wonders that adult eyes could never comprehend. But beneath the enchantment, Martha glimpsed something else, a flicker of recognition, of desperate pleading, as if some small part of her daughter remained trapped within the wheel's hypnotic embrace, crying out for rescue. "Fight it, my darling," Martha whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Remember who you are. Remember your mother's love." For one beautiful, terrible moment, Constance's turning slowed. Her lips moved as if to speak, and hope blazed in Martha's breast like a candle flame in winter darkness. Then the wheel's song swelled to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, and Constance spun from her mother's grasp with supernatural strength. Martha stumbled backward, her hands burning as if she had grasped red-hot coals, and watched in horror as her daughter resumed her place in the circle of the damned. The children's humming had evolved into something beyond human music, a sound that spoke of vast spaces between the stars, of time measured not in years but in eons, of hungers that could never be satisfied by mortal sustenance. It filled the air like honey, thick and sweet and suffocating, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to remember why breathing and thinking mattered at all. Dr. Whitmore was the first to succumb. His medical bag slipped from nerveless fingers as he took an involuntary step toward the wheel, his face slack with wonder. "Beautiful," he murmured, his voice distant and dreamy. "So very beautiful. How could I not have seen it before?" Constable Bradford grabbed the physician's arm, hauling him back with rough soldier's efficiency. "Steady on, man. Don't let it take you too." But the effort cost him, and Martha saw sweat beading on the constable's forehead despite the cool autumn air. The wheel's song was insidious, creeping into the mind like fog through window cracks, promising peace, promising rest, promising an end to all earthly troubles. Reverend Good alone seemed immune to the wheel's call, though the cost of resistance showed in every line of his weathered face. He clutched his Bible with white-knuckled hands, muttering prayers in Latin, Greek, and languages Martha didn't recognize, desperate invocations drawn from the deepest wells of faith. "We must leave this place," he gasped, "before we all fall prey to its influence. Already I feel my resolve weakening, my thoughts growing clouded. Whatever power inhabits that wheel, it grows stronger with each passing moment." But Martha could not leave her daughter, not while hope remained. She watched as Constance completed another revolution, the child's face turned skyward now, her eyes reflecting not the pale autumn sun but some inner radiance that was beautiful and terrible to behold. "There must be a way," Martha whispered, "some manner of breaking this spell." The Pemberton family, when they disappeared, their clothes were found beside the wheel pit. Perhaps if we examine the site more closely. "No." Reverend Good's voice cracked like a whip. Whatever befell the Pembertons, we must not repeat their fate. The wheel has already claimed 6 souls. We cannot afford to lose more." Yet even as he spoke, Martha saw young Thomas Hartwell, one of the twins, begin to drift closer to the wheel itself. His turning had taken on a different quality, no longer the stationary rotation of the others, but a gradual spiral inward, toward the massive wooden paddles that caught the creek water and transformed it into power. The other children followed suit, their synchronized dance evolving into something more complex and sinister. They moved like planets around the sun, drawing ever closer to their terrible center, and Martha understood with crystalline clarity that when they reached the wheel itself, they would be lost forever. Night fell with unnatural swiftness, as if the very sun fled from the horror taking place beside Mill Creek. Lanterns flickered to life throughout Millbrook as worried parents gathered to discuss the fate of their children. Some spoke of fetching help from Boston, of summoning men of learning who might understand what no village mind could comprehend. Others whispered of older remedies, salt circles and rowan branches, holy water and silver crosses, desperate folk magic passed down through generations of immigrant families. But as midnight approached, bringing with it the anniversary of the Pembertons' disappearance, it became clear that time was running short. The children had drawn so close to the wheel now that spray from the rushing water kissed their faces, and their humming had taken on harmonics that resonated in the bones of those who heard it. Martha stood vigil through the darkest hours, her eyes never leaving her daughter's small form. Constance moved with ethereal grace, her nightgown billowing around her like angels' wings, and there were moments when she seemed almost transparent, as if the wheel's influence was slowly dissolving the very substance of her being. Dr. Whitmore had long since fled, unable to bear witness to forces that made mockery of his scientific training. Constable Bradford remained, but his face was gray as grave dirt and his hands shook so violently he could barely hold his lantern steady. Only Reverend Good maintained his post, though his prayers had grown weaker, more desperate, as if he battled against invisible hands that sought to tear the holy words from his throat. As the clock tower in Millbrook Center chimed midnight, the wheel's song reached a crescendo that seemed to split the very air. The children's voices rose in perfect harmony, no longer recognizably human but something older, wilder, touched with the madness of spaces between worlds. And then, as the last chime faded into silence, young William Good reached the wheel itself. The boy's small hand touched one of the massive wooden paddles, and instantly the entire structure blazed with cold fire. Not the warm yellow flame of hearth and home, but a sickly phosphorescence that hurt the eyes to look upon. William's form became translucent, shot through with veins of that terrible light, and for one horrifying moment Martha could see through him to the wheel beyond. The boy opened his mouth as if to scream, but only music emerged, pure, crystalline notes that seemed to remake the world around them. The other children quickened their pace, drawn irresistibly toward their transformed companion, and Martha knew that within moments they too would join the wheel's eternal dance. Desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Breaking free from the paralysis that had held her through the long night, Martha rushed forward, her hands outstretched toward her daughter. But the air around the wheel had grown thick as honey, resistant to movement, and each step required tremendous effort. Behind her, Reverend Good's voice rose in a final, desperate prayer, not in any earthly language but in tongues of fire that seemed to burn the very darkness. His words clashed against the wheel's song like sword against shield, creating harmonies that spoke of cosmic battles fought in the spaces between stars. Martha's fingers brushed Constance's shoulder just as the child reached the wheel's edge. For an instant mother and daughter were connected, not by flesh alone but by bonds deeper than blood, love that transcended mortal understanding, a tie that not even death could sever. In that moment of contact, Martha saw the truth. The wheel was not merely a mill's machinery gone mad with supernatural hunger, but a gateway, a tear in the fabric of reality through which things from outside time and space could reach through to touch the world of men. The children were not being destroyed but transformed, made into conduits through which alien geometries could reshape the very nature of existence. She saw the Pemberton family not as victims but as willing servants, their consciousness expanded beyond human limitations to encompass vistas of terrible beauty. She saw the true history of the land, how the wheel had stood here since before the first human footstep touched American soil, built by intelligences that viewed mankind as children view insects, fascinating but ultimately expendable. And she saw what Constance would become, not dead but something far more terrible, a bridge between worlds that should never touch, a lens through which horrors beyond imagination could focus their attention upon the earth. The vision lasted only seconds, but in that time Martha aged years. When she stumbled backward, her hair had turned white as winter snow, and her eyes held depths that no mortal gaze should plumb. Constance had vanished into the wheel's embrace, her form merging with the phosphorescent fire that now engulfed the entire structure. One by one, the other children followed, their small bodies dissolving into light that was both beautiful and damning. Their voices continued to rise in harmony with the wheel's song, but now Martha understood that it was not music at all but mathematics, equations that described the folding of space-time, formulas that could remake reality according to alien design. Reverend Good collapsed beside her, his strength finally exhausted. But his sacrifice had not been in vain, for his prayers had bought them precious moments, time enough for the wheel's appetite to be sated, for the gateway to seal itself until the next turning of celestial cycles called it back to wakefulness. As dawn broke over Millbrook, casting pale light across the mill grounds, nothing remained but empty clothes scattered in the grass and the wheel itself, silent now, wooden and mundane, showing no sign of the cosmic horror it had briefly revealed. The official report blamed the children's disappearance on a flash flood, though Mill Creek ran clear and shallow as always. Dr. Whitmore left town that very day, never to return. Constable Bradford resigned his post and took to drink, muttering about music that wouldn't leave his head. Only Martha and Reverend Good remained to keep the secret, and the burden aged them both beyond their years. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the fog rolls thick along Mill Creek, the wheel turns again. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the children singing, their voices calling to the young ones who walk too close to the water's edge, promising wonders beyond imagination, inviting them to join the dance that never ends. The mill still stands, though the town council has talked for years of tearing it down. They cite safety concerns, structural decay, the usual mundane worries of civic responsibility. But Martha knows the truth. They fear it without understanding why, sensing danger in its weathered timbers and broken stones. She visits sometimes, drawn by memories of the daughter she lost and the daughter she saved from a fate worse than death. For in those final moments, when their souls touched across the gulf between worlds, Martha had made a choice that would haunt her remaining days. She had let Constance go willingly into the wheel's embrace, understanding that to fight further would only doom more innocents to share her child's fate. The wheel feeds on love as much as hunger, the love of parents for children, the bonds that tie families together across the years. It uses that love as an anchor, a way to pull more souls into its terrible mechanism. By releasing her daughter, Martha had broken the chain, denied the wheel the leverage it needed to claim the entire town. But the cost was beyond calculation. Some nights she wakes to the sound of children singing, and for a moment her heart leaps with the impossible hope that Constance has found her way home. Then she remembers the truth, that her daughter is forever lost in spaces between atoms, serving masters whose names would drive mortal minds to madness. The wheel waits still, patient as stone, hungry as winter. It knows that time means nothing to things that existed before the first star kindled in the void. Someday new children will come to play beside Mill Creek, and their laughter will wake the old hungers. The wheel will turn again, and the song will begin anew. Martha prays she will not live to see that day, but prayers, she has learned, are fragile things when measured against the mathematics of cosmic horror. The wheel has all the time in the world, and infinity is a very long time indeed. In the town records, filed under unexplained incidents, lies Reverend Good's final report on the mill wheel affair. It is written in a shaking hand, peppered with blotted ink and tear stains, speaking of forces beyond human understanding and prices paid in innocence and love. The last line, barely legible, serves as both warning and epitaph. God forgive us all, for we have gazed upon the face of eternity, and it was not beautiful.